everyone we've known that gets Springlock to death is really fucking pissed about it.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs. The Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello and welcome back to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm your host with the toast, Rytos, here to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's as we always do. Today's topic is kind of something that I've been meaning to talk about for a while, but I haven't had the capacity to. Okay, I'll stop beating around the bush. All right, let's just get right into it. I finally finished all of the Fazbear Frights books. I have read all of them. It is official. I've read every FNAF book except for the Freddy files. I don't own any of them, or the security breach guidebook. I don't own any of the guidebooks. I've read the security logbook, the novel trilogy, Fazbear Frights, and Tales from the Pizzaplex. I'm officially caught up on every book. So now whenever somebody says, obviously you don't read the books, now you can just say, they did. They just forgot because they're a little stupid. But I wanted to talk about them. This week's video is going to be what I did for the Silver Eyes, but for Fazbear Frights. I have a feeling it's going to upset a lot of people because Fazbear Frights, I feel like Tales from the Pizzaplex is probably the most debated book series right now. But Fazbear Frights is a huge topic of debate in the fandom. So before we get into specifics that I want to talk about these books, we should bring up canonicity, right? We should broach that topic. As far as I'm aware, looking through online, the only direct statement Scott ever made about Fazbear Frights and whether or not they're connected to the games or whatnot is he said, and I quote, I have it pulled up because I'm bringing it up in the video. Where is it? Now this was before this was in, I believe, 2019. So this was right as they're right before they're coming out. My timelines are a little mixed, but he was talking about Fazbear Frights when he said, it will be a collection of short horror stories that takes place in the FNAF universe. The series will launch with 5 books, each containing 3 different short stories with unique characters and plot lines, some connected to the games and some not. So, thanks, Scott. Some of them are directly connected to the games, period. That's all he says. So, are they canon? It seems like it's on a story-by-story basis, and even then, when he says directly connected, is it a one-to-one recreation of something that's happening in the game's timeline? Or is it just that there are characters directly from the games in these stories? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't think there's a good way to tell. So I think this does technically confirm that not every single one of them is directly connected. He did literally say some of them are not directly connected to the games. So, I mean, that's worth something, you know? Also, if you're wondering why red today, it's 90 degrees today. I'm dying. This is the only cool-ish room in the house. So I felt red was fitting. But so the canonicity is neither here nor there. I think it has to be case-by-case basis anyway. I wish we had a blanket statement we could use, but we can't. So let's start with a non-controversial, non-heavily debated topic to kind of ease our way into Fazbear Frights in a way that won't, off-put half of my audience. So let's talk about Andrew and Jake. And half of you go, who that? And the other half are getting very worried for what I'm about to talk about. So also, for the record, because I know one of you motherfuckers is going to try it, I'm going to have, and this is no bullshit, sorry if you really like seeing my face in these podcast episodes, I'm going to put a 30% opacity text right here that says, this is a clip from a larger podcast. Watch it for full context. Right here. And it's going to remain here until I'm done talking about Fazbear Frights. Because the last time I didn't do that, someone took a 10-second clip from a podcast, put it to Twitter and said, can you believe what Rytoast believes? And I had to go, yeah, you cut out the other half of the sentence. So I'm putting it here. Go fuck yourself, Clippers. You can't get me this time. You're gonna try. You can't get me this time. Anyway, so Andrew and Jake. what's their deal? Who are we talking about? So these are the two souls within the Stitchwraith stingers, and they can be traced back. I've got my notes here, and you kind of have to because like there's so much going on. And if I say any of this wrong, I've got my full notes for this Friday's video that are like perfect. These are my rush notes because it's earlier in the week and I just finished reading all these books. So some of the information might be slightly jumbled. I'll do my best. If I make any inaccuracies, feel free to correct me in the comments. So if I understand correctly, Andrew was the battery inside Fetch. Not originally, but that's where he kind of goes to, and that's how he gets into the Stitchwraith. And Jake was the mask of the Simon doll, which then gets put on the Stitchwraith. So, okay, what are any of those words that I've said? Let's start at the Stitchwraith and work our way backwards. The Stitchwraith, which is the main antagonist character, anti-hero kind of thing of the epilogues, is essentially a shambled together endoskeleton fueled with agony and some kind of spiritual intelligence that is trying to collect all of the agony ridden pieces still around to get them all in one place, and I believe just try to get rid of them was the original intent. But it will pretty much kill anything it touches because it's got so much agony and a lot of aggression from Andrew. Now, Andrew isn't like a malicious spirit. He's not trying to kill these people. He's just really fucking pissed and accidentally kills people. So they got to be careful. But the Stitchwraith was a creation by, oh God, this is what's going to get me into trouble. Phineas. Sorry, I mix up, I believe it's Taggart and Talbert. Fuck you, Scott, for making those the two names that are important here. So I'm going to call one of them Phineas so I don't have to worry about the last name. Dr. Phineas of Ferb fame, he was studying agony, which is something we will get into in this podcast. But he was studying agony and the effects of it. And he basically wanted to make like a golem of agony to see if he could create life, essentially. So he got as much agony, like he was a collector of objects that seemed like they had agony on them and was studying the effects of them. And finally, he ordered the Fetch doll, the Fetch like dog, which is an animatronic dog from an earlier story. The Simon doll, which is I don't think it was an animatronic. I think it was just a doll with a baby monitor behind it that gets possessed. But he ordered from an earlier story. And then a mirror that witnessed a man kill his family, which is crazy. And then a broken up full body endoskeleton. And he basically sets up the endoskeleton, puts... Oh God, what is the order of events here? Yes, okay. I had to double check because the summary doesn't go into it. And like, whenever I talk about these books, I try to have their summaries pulled up so I can like quick reference. And the summary didn't go into it, but he basically puts all of his agony stuff pointed at this thing and uses a device to just like try to shove as much agony into this endoskeleton as possible after he fixes it up a bit. And then once he's done, he has that set, he leaves, he comes back, it's like everything's done, he's getting massive readings off this thing, he's like, okay, we have an agony endoskeleton, let me give it drive, let me give it purpose. So he takes the mask from the Simon doll and puts it on it for a face to kind of give it like personality, and the battery from the Fetch animatronic and puts it in the chest to give it like a heart, essentially. And it works. It stands up and it's suddenly like a conscious golem of agony and power. And Phineas is overjoyed and immediately gets killed. I'm sorry. This is like, was it supposed to be funny? Because it's a little funny. The idea of like, can you imagine? And I get it. Like he's like kind of like a mad scientist, so he's not taking precautions here. But can you imagine your entire life's work is studying agony, which is often caused by violence. And then you pump all of the agony you've collected into one like human-sized being, including agony from a mirror that witnessed a man kill his family, and then you give it life, and you don't think to have like a wall in between you two. You're just standing in front of it. My guy, you created the perfect killing machine. Of course it's going to kill you frame one. But so that's how we get the Stitchwraith. But the Stitchwraith is piloted by two beings. So like I said, there's Andrew and Jake. Andrew is the soul that part of him was inside of the battery of Fetch. I don't think it's ever directly explained if it's his soul or like his agony, but because it's his personality and his consciousness and awareness, I would wager to bet it's more like soul or remnant than it is agony. That's just my understanding. I could be wrong there. But Andrew is a very interesting character, right? Because the man in room 1280. So that's another story, tangent again. We got to build our way to Andrew and Jake. Andrew and Jake are the top of this mountain. So the man in room 1280. This is probably the closest story connected to a game I've ever seen. But I have some things about it that people are not going to like. And I know the people that aren't going to like it already know what I'm going to say. But we'll get there. Essentially, there is a man who is fully burnt and unidentifiable. Barely alive. You can see his organs through his skin a little bit. Like, he should not be alive. They've tried to kill him multiple times. The nurses think he's just an evil, just a mass of evil. But there are two pings in his brain, which people think they're like doing that reading. It's almost like there's two people in his mind. And there's also this little boy named Andrew with curly brown hair and an alligator mask, tormenting the nurses around him and trying to keep him alive, essentially. Like, anyone who tries to kill him, Andrew stops them. It's like, no, he needs to be alive. Meanwhile, the man in the bed just kept saying, but he eventually gets out Fazbear Dis Center, and they realize it's Fazbear Distribution Center. So eventually, the priest they hired to exorcise this man brings him to the Fazbear Distribution Center. They get somewhere. And the moment they get inside, he starts like convulsing and just explodes. And his like black ooze that was inside of him goes over a bunch of shit that was in that warehouse. And that's where a lot of the agony things from the Fazbear stories come from. Essentially, the agony of William Afton explodes and possesses a bunch of nearby Fazbear shit. And that's how most of the Fazbear Frights stories happen. So that being said, Andrew gets flung into Fetch in that moment. So then Fetch then goes to Phineas. Phineas takes the battery, puts it in the Stitchwraith. Andrew is now in the Stitchwraith. What about Jake? Jake is a sickly little boy who is in bed. I believe he has cancer, but he is bedridden and can't like walk anywhere or do anything. He tries to go with his friends in like a wheelbarrow to sneak out, and he ends up like throwing up and passing out and needs to go back to bedridden. So he's bedridden entirely. And he talks to a Simon doll that's in a cupboard. He's not allowed to see the Simon doll because the nurse is kind of updating, or like not nurse, she's more of like a helper, but like his caretaker is updating the doll with the things he does. So what's actually happening here is this sickly kid is talking to this Simon doll, but the Simon doll just has a baby monitor kind of like voice thing behind it. And his father, who's overseas in the war, is talking to him every night. But he's pretending to be the Simon doll to kind of like reassure him. And then Jake will be like, oh yeah, I was just in bed today. And then his dad would be like, oh, what did the real Jake do? As like a way for Jake to be like, oh, the real Jake got to play with his friends today, and like pretend like he's doing that. And the caretaker would then update the doll, like if the real Jake like got a black eye today, then she would blacken in one of the eyes and things like that. Eventually the dad dies in the war. So the caretaker kind of, does she break the news to him? I got to double check. There's so many like minute details that you have to double check in these books, but they're important, you know, like everything's important. I'm not minute. When I say minute detail, I'm not saying unimportant. Minute just means, you know, small and specific. Okay. Yeah. So she doesn't say your dad died. She just said Simon's not going to visit tonight, and he gets kind of disappointed. That night there's like weird noises coming from the baby monitor, but she like tries to check, but Jake seems fine. Oh, no. She tries to check, but the voices have stopped then. So she's just like, okay, I don't want to disturb him. I'll go back to bed. But then she goes in the morning. Jake is even worse. And Jake says he doesn't want to pretend anymore and goes back to sleep. So Jake's like, I don't want to pretend anymore, and goes back to sleep. Now remember, Jake's been pretending that he's all right. So Margie's like, okay, we'll move him to hospice. He's not getting better. We'll help him in his way out. But by the time the ambulance arrives for hospice, Jake's dead. And they're all sad and tearful, and nobody notices the Simon doll is gone. So presumably the implication is Jake is finally the real Jake because he possesses the Simon doll and now is able to leave and do what he wants. That Simon doll then eventually down the grapevine ends up with Phineas, and he takes the mask from it and puts it on the Stitchwraith. And that's how Jake gets in the Stitchwraith. So now we're at Stitchwraith, Jake, and Andrew. It was a long walk, but we got there. God, I didn't even get to talk about Agony or Remnant yet, and we're like almost 20 minutes in. Okay, we'll get there. The Stitchwraith is an interesting concept because so Jake is the face and can see and like take in the surrounding environment, but can't control the Stitchwraith in any way. Can't move the body or anything like that. Andrew is the heart of the Stitchwraith and can control the body and also accidentally keeps killing people, but he can't see anything. It is pitch black for him. So they kind of have to work together. And I think that's a really cool concept. Funnily enough, I was talking to my wife after I kind of read the Stitchwraith stingers. It's really funny the coincidences that happen. Me and my wife, way back in high school, were trying to write a novel, and we never finished it. We never even got halfway done. But the conceit of it was a couple where, well, not a couple. They were like they both would want to be a couple, but they never get there. But the conceit of it is that the story would swap between perspectives every chapter. Both of them would be the main two characters recalling an event. So for the, I think her name was Danny. For her chapters, she was giving her testimony because Derek is dead. So she's giving her testimony to the police. And eventually it would have swapped to present because we would have caught up to the present. And the other chapters were Derek, who should be dead. But as we find out in the story, he like dies. The friends try to do some kind of seance to bring him back, kind of roughly. This was a while ago, so I'm, but on the way back, essentially I think it was like a demon latches onto him. So what they bring back isn't Derek, but it looks just like him. Derek, they think, is like gone forever, and they run. They're like, we don't know what to do, and that's when the police interrupt. But the chapters from Derek's perspective, Derek is talking to this demon, and he can't see anything. He's just kind of like in a void, not sure what's going on, but he can kind of hear the outside world. And he's like, hey, I'm supposed to be dead. Why am I hearing the outside? And the demon talking to him is like, just shut up and tell me who you are. I need to pretend to be you. And that's where we get Derek's backstory. But what's actually happening, the demon possessed his body and is piloting it and is trying to go and seek out, I don't even remember what it was at the time. But it's kind of really funny, like the coincidence that this like story we never even got halfway done writing heavily featured a character who it was two consciousnesses within one body, and one of them could, now it's not, again, one of them could see and control, and one of them could only hear a little bit and talk to the other. So it's not like one-to-one with the Stitchwraith or anything, but it's just kind of funny how like weirdly similar that is. It's a fun coincidence. Anyway, super long tangent aside. The Stitchwraith. So again, it's not, I say antagonist, it's kind of just an antagonist to the human characters because it keeps accidentally killing them. But the Stitchwraith does generally seem to be like, hey, we're trying to collect the agony stuff and get rid of it. We are trying our best. But we just keep killing people. So Andrew and Jake, the big question a lot of people are debating is that are Andrew and Jake in the actual FNAF games? Are these Stitchwraith stingers one-to-one with the game's timeline? And that's pretty much the big question with Fazbear Frights, because there are stories directly connected to the stingers, and if the stingers are in the continuity of the games, so would those stories, sure. But as far as like individual stories, those get debated less. The main debate I hear with Fazbear Frights is, are the Stitchwraith stingers and their associated stories in the game's continuity? And that's a good question. Because if they are, ostensibly, the vengeful spirit from Ultimate Custom Night would be Andrew, and the crying child would be Jake. So, and it might not even be an Afton. So what I mean by this, and you could argue that crying child and Jake could be two different characters in the same continuity. That's fine. I could see that, but they are very similar. Jake and crying child, Andrew and the vengeful spirit, very, very similar, right? Because in the books, Andrew is trying to keep, in the books, Andrew is trying to keep William alive specifically to make him suffer and torture him, which sounds a lot like Ultimate Custom Night. It's pretty much one-to-one with Ultimate Custom Night. And then Jake is a sickly hospital-ridden kid who talks to a toy that is secretly his father, which sounds a lot like the crying child. And then they both go on to possess something filled with agony, which in the games could be Golden Freddy. Or if this is one-to-one with the games, the Stitchwraith is just in the games. That's totally fair. But both could also be true, because it seems like these Fazbear Frights stories, at least the ones Man in Room 1280 onward, take place after Ultimate Custom Night. So it could be that part of the souls are there and part of the soul is in the Stitchwraith, because it does seem very clear not all of Andrew and Jake are in the Stitchwraith. Part of them are. Their memories are foggy. They're not quite sure where they are or what's going on. It seems like part of their consciousness is in the Stitchwraith, not all of it. Whereas maybe in Golden Freddy, if they shared that, they were. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the question is that true for the games? And this is what happens between Ultimate Custom Night and Help Wanted? Or are these books trying to teach us something about how the vengeful spirit and the crying child function in the games? That's the big debate, right? That is the main debate going on. And I'm going to be honest. My bit for a long time was that, like, if Andrew turns out to be in the games or in the movie, I'm walking out. It's all over. I'm done for. I'm not okay with it. I would be okay with it after reading all the Fazbear Frights books if we get direct evidence of Andrew in the games or the movie or something like that. If we do get direct evidence of that, I'd be okay with it. I would. But here's the thing. As far as I'm aware, we do not currently have any direct evidence of Andrew or Jake existing in the games. So it's a leap of faith either way, right? Because I don't like the narrative I've seen online, especially, where one side of this argument is correct and the other side is lying to themselves. Because frankly, both sides of this argument are doing it, where the people who believe that Andrew and Jake are in the games are like, obviously you never read the books. If you read the books, it's clear they have to be in the games, and you're an idiot if you think anything else. But then there's also the other side of it, where the people who don't think that Andrew and Jake are in the games are like, why would you think that all of this lore that's never mentioned in the games would be in the games? You're an idiot for thinking that. I genuinely think that both arguments are completely valid. The idea, like, Jake and Andrew fit very well into the FNAF timeline if they are in the FNAF timeline. But there's no evidence that they do exist within the games, right? Where we do have some, even then, that's my bias coming out. We also have very, 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 very little evidence that someone like Cassidy exists in the games, right? Because as far as the vengeful spirit goes, I tend to believe it's Cassidy for the security logbook, which isn't a FNAF game, and the fact that the Princess Quest sprite in Security Breach was originally named Cassidy, but it was then changed to Princess. So there's also very little evidence of Cassidy. And as far as the Crying Child, obviously we have evidence that the Crying Child exists. We don't have evidence directly saying who it is. Although I will say, if Jake is in the games, I don't think he is the Crying Child. I think the Crying Child just does something else. Because like it's very well established, Jake's father is in the war overseas. The Crying Child's father is William Afton. And he's probably a draft dodger. So I don't think William Afton's in the war. So if Jake is in the games, he's not the Crying Child. So there's that side. I've so far talked about the argument of like, this is what happens in the games timeline if Andrew and Jake are in the games, which essentially, if Andrew and Jake are in the games timeline, their stories take place after Ultimate Custom Night, and it explains where most of William Afton goes after Ultimate Custom Night and after FNAF 6. So what about the other side of that argument? What if Andrew and Jake aren't in the games? What changes then? Well, like I mentioned, Andrew really is very similar to the Vengeful Spirit. And Jake is very similar to the Crying Child. If these characters aren't in the games, but are meant to answer questions that we have about the games, then these characters and the way they interact with the story, I think, are trying to teach us more about the Vengeful Spirit and Crying Child. If they're not in the games, that's what I think their purpose are. So what could they teach us about the Vengeful Spirit and the Crying Child? Well, let's go over them. Andrew is interesting, right? We know that Andrew is generally a little malicious and that he definitely is doing Ultimate Custom Night in the books, where he's keeping William alive and torturing him. We also can speculate why. Andrew doesn't really remember a Stitchwraith because, again, he's fragmented. But in the story The New Kid, for a moment, when one of the characters looks inside of Fredbear, they see short, curly, black hair. For a moment, and then it's gone, and then he, dies. The only other character that comes to mind for me of a spirit that would be in there is Andrew. So it's that idea of perhaps the Vengeful Spirit is so vengeful because that was the only kid killed with spring locks. William, stabs, whatever. William kills the other kids and stuffs their body into suits. But the Vengeful Spirit, the one you should not have killed, he put into the golden Freddy suit and activated the spring locks. And that's how he killed him. That would make sense. Everyone we've known that gets spring locked to death is really fucking pissed about it and defies death because of it. So, a child being killed by Springlock suit, then becoming the Vengeful Spirit because of that, tracks. Now, here's the interesting thing. A couple videos ago, I did a whole thing on the implications that keep popping up about Golden Freddy, Cassidy, and drowning, specifically in red liquid. Now, Dark Circus, the Great Escape Golden Freddy is in blue liquid, sure. But in FNAF World, it's a red lake. In Ultimate Custom Night, the Old Man Consequences bit is, again, a red lake. It's the same lake. In Ruin, it's a red lake in the cave. And this was pointed out to me. I totally missed this. In Help Wanted, Dreadbear, that whole DLC, you're next to a red lake surrounded by dead trees, just like FNAF World, just like Ultimate Custom Night, just like Ruin, and Dreadbear walks out of the red lake and goes into the barn. Again, Fredbear, drowning, red lakes. I want to talk about the implications of Dreadbear, of many instances of Fredbear going into a red lake and one instance of Dreadbear coming out of a red lake. I want to talk about that. But before we get there, I was thinking about, and I've always been like, does the implication mean that he drowned Cassidy? That seems weird. And a bunch of people pointed this out. I totally blanked on it. The Silver Eyes. Let me read you in the Silver Eyes the way William Afton describes the death that would happen to you if you get spring locked. You'll try to scream. This is the end of it. You'll try to scream, but you will be unable to. Your vocal cords will be severed, and your lungs will fill with your own blood until you drown in it. If you die from Springlocks, you drown in your own blood, like a red lake would do. If Andrew and Jake are not in the games, I think these books are trying to tell us, and again, a lot of what I'm talking about today is just going to be Saturday's video, but like this is the me rambling version of it, and that'll be the like concise version. But a lot of what these books are trying to tell us, if Andrew is not in the games, I think then the book is trying to tell us that the vengeful spirit is Cassidy. And the reason Cassidy is the vengeful spirit is because they were killed using a Springlock suit, and they drowned in their own blood and had a horrific death. Now here's the interesting thing. Golden Freddy goes into the Red Lake. Fredbear goes into the Red Lake. Dreadbear comes out. A black, spookier version. Does that not sound like Remnant and then Agony? Maybe Cassidy is more Agony than she is Remnant. Moving on to Jake, because we're already at like 30 minutes. I like that a lot. So again, if Jake is not in the games, then what is Jake trying to teach us about the crying child? I think if Jake isn't in the games, it is incredibly strong evidence that the Fredbear plushes are William Afton. I think that is incredibly strong evidence. Because think about it. We literally have a kid in a hospital bed talking to a doll that secretly has a walkie-talkie to his father. And then in FNAF 4, we have a kid who ends up in a hospital bed talking to a doll that in the next game is next to a walkie-talkie in his father's office. I think if Jake is not in the games, this is like almost confirmation of the Fredbear plushes being William Afton. It is such good evidence for it. But again, what do I think? Do I think Jake and Andrew are in the games? Right now, no. But I am willing to change my mind. Before I was not. Now, if there is evidence that I find or comes up or is shown to me or comes out in a new game that points to that, I am open to it. I mean, I would have been open to it anyway if like the name Andrew pops up or we see like a kid with short curly brown hair and an alligator mask. Because I understand there is a kid with an alligator mask in the FNAF 3 Happiest Day cutscene. I understand that, but I don't think that's strong enough evidence. You know, like that'd be the same thing as like, well, Montgomery Gator exists, so Andrew exists. Like, well, but we've been talking about just Jake and Andrew for 30 minutes. This was supposed to be Fazbear Frights in general. So I guess if you want my other thoughts on Fazbear Frights, including Agony and Remnant, you'll have to wait for this weekend's video because we got questions to go into. If you want questions answered on this podcast, you can send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com, or you can put them on Spotify. But if you want to send it to the email, that's in the description. Copy and paste it. It's a pain to type. Our first question is from Mike. They, them. All the questions I grabbed were from Fazbear Frights. That's what's on my mind right now. What if the endoskeleton used to make the Stitchwraith was the mimic? The Stitchwraith was made out of random scrap found by Phineas Taggart. Could it be possible that he found an old, out-of-commission mimic endo? Thank you for your question, Mike. I think that's super possible. Do I think when the Stitchwraith stingers were being written, the mimic was in Scott's head? Maybe not. But in retrospect, I totally forgot about this. In the final confrontation in the 11th stinger, Jake is like dozing off and not all there. And he dreams of having a birthday party with all of his friends. The crying child connections are crazy. Okay. I forgot the wild scene of Jake lying unconscious in the ball pit and just like helping souls be freed while just like they're still trapped in the ball pit, but he's like helping them be trapped in a peaceful way. It's wild. It is interesting. If we compare, because like in the Stitchwraith Stingers, that endoskeleton's still there. It's just in the ball pit. It's broken beyond belief, but it's still there. The mask isn't on the mimic. So I don't, now this wasn't your question, but there would have to be some kind of change from Stitchwraith to, I guess it would be to the epilogues of Tales. Actually, the Stitchwraith, right, beat up endoskeleton, got heated up a lot, possibly. I don't know if it's ever mentioned directly if it's burnt. I don't remember. But the main identifying factor, battery pack here, which is damaged, and the mask. In the epilogues of Tales, the one that arrives at the Pizzaplex, the mimic that arrives at the Pizzaplex, is a very burnt and off-color endoskeleton with a shiny new head. I don't know if the Stitchwraith was made out of a mimic. It makes a lot of sense. But if it was, I wonder if it's the same one that we see in the epilogues from Tales. I'm probably not the first one to make that connection, but you know, it's very interesting thinking about it. But I hope that answered your question. I kind of just rambled for a bit, but it's possible, maybe. I don't know. Thank you for your question, Mike. The next question comes from John, he, him. Is there any other way you would want to experience FNAF, meaning trading cards, ARGs, IRL attractions? Me personally, I would love an adaptation or original Goosebumps-style show of Fazbear Frights, especially the Breaking Wheel. Thank you for your question, John. Casey just flushed the toilet. So that's something I have to deal with now. Anyway, personally, I do agree with you. I think a Goosebumps-style show using all of the short stories we've gotten so far and then more, I think that'd be awesome. I'd be so down for that. I don't know if I would, I think maybe it'd be cooler animated so they can like be more faithful to the stories. But if they made it live action, that'd be sick too. I don't know. I think that'd be a really, really fun idea. As far as other ways to experience FNAF, I really just, and I know Scott has come out and said, like, I don't want to do a Freddy's restaurant because, God forbid, some crazy person goes and kills kids at a Freddy's restaurant. That'll ruin the lives of those people, ruin Scott mentally, ruin the brand. So I understand. But I don't want that risk as well. But I do wish there was a way to have like a Freddy's restaurant to go to a la Chuck E. Cheese. I think that'd be so goddamn cool. But I understand. Maybe they can just do ghost kitchen pizzas and I'll call it there. But that would be my big wish. But thank you for your question, John. And our last question from Mike, he, him. Do you think the future movies will continue to follow elements of the novel trilogy or even take some elements from the Fazbear Frights books? I think they already have taken elements from the Fazbear Frights books, frankly. I mean, the Ella doll, right? Now, there's a lot of weirdness around it, but in the movie, there's that big old Springlock Ella doll, which is crazy. And I do still think that is the movie's stand-in for Circus Baby. I do think that is true. However, whatever you feel about it, the Ella doll's not only in the novels, but in 1:35 a.m., I'm going to double check. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, in Fazbear Frights, there's also an Ella doll. So, I mean, immediately there's one connection. But no, I could totally see that, especially if they start delving into Remnant or Agony. There's a lot of information we get about Remnant and Agony in Fazbear Frights. Like in the novels in the Fourth Closet, we get kind of the initial information about Remnant, where it's like William experimenting with it and kind of showing the uses of it, but it gets expanded upon in Fazbear Frights. I think it's described at one point that Remnant isn't necessarily the mixture of metal and spirit, but it's more so Remnant is like electricity and water, and metal is the conduit. And I think that's a really good explanation for it. So I think they'll have to eventually, if not just for world building stuff. As far as like actual characters, who knows? But I mean, I think it's totally possible, if not likely. So thank you for your question. And again, kind of a speed round. But if you have more questions, the email's in the description, Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast @gmail.com. But in the meantime, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.